So I'd like to welcome today to the entoLIVE program Millie Hood, Dr. Millie Hood. Millie is somebody that I've worked with before on this very project. But I don't know a lot about what has happened since the project is kind of wrapping up. So I'm really excited about today's talk. Millie will be talking to us about spiders, earthworms, and beetles and the impacts of cover crop frost tolerance. So Millie, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Kieran, and for having me today. So I'm a postdoc at the University of Reading in the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. And this project, which I'm going to talk to you about today, which is a collaboration between the University of Reading and LEAF, which are a farmer association. So they work on integrated farm management, so things like integrated pest management and sustainable farming, and they have a large farmer base in the UK. You may have seen their logo here on some food products, which means that they're certified by LEAF. And today I'm going to talk to you about the impacts of cover crop frost tolerance on spiders, earthworms, and beetles. And so starting very broad here about agriculture in general, agriculture is a major land use. So 29% of global area is land. And of that land, 71% is habitable. And of that 71% of habitable land, 50% is agriculture. So the point I want to make here is that agriculture constitutes a major land use. Not only is it important for producing food, but it also is really important for how we manage land. And agriculture has been receiving a lot of attention because current farming practices are driving climate change and biodiversity loss. And producing food will do this to a certain extent, but it's about reducing or managing the impacts as much as possible. So here you can see a familiar plot of global carbon emissions from 1750 to 2017. And here you see WWF's Living Planet Index, which shows decline in vertebrate abundance from 1970 to 2018. And these are global trends. And by various estimates, agriculture has been shown to account for a third of global carbon emissions and to be the primary threat to 86% of species at risk of extinction. So it is having major impacts environmentally, whilst also producing the food that we need. So the challenge is, how can we feed, clothe, house, and power 11 billion people whilst reducing these environmental impacts, but also creating resilience to them? So increasing, these are all photos from the UK in the last 5 years, and increasing droughts are reducing crop yields and also causing things like soil erosion and damage. We also have increasing winter rain and extreme weather events, which is causing flooding and impacting crop yield as well. So the Showcase project is interested in finding synergies between agriculture and biodiversity and ecosystem services to help farmers capitalize on native biodiversity. And we're working with 23 organizations across 15 countries. And this project has been running since 2020. This is funded by the European Union's major funding program, which is called Horizon 2020. One of the main aspects of this international collaboration is the development of these things we're calling experimental biodiversity areas, which essentially means that we're running experiments across 10 countries, which have contrasting farming systems. And within each of these countries, we've been working with farmers and local actors to co-develop biodiversity interventions to test ways of farming that can benefit biodiversity and production, so benefiting both at the same time. And within the UK, the specific aim was to recruit a group of farmers and co-design an intervention that could promote biodiversity and production, and then to experimentally test the impact of this intervention. We have also ran additional projects. So you may have been at Stuart's entoLIVE, Stuart's pictured here in the middle, that he did a couple of months ago. And that was to do with citizen science work within the Showcase project, which was run in collaboration with butterfly conservation. We've also developed an app which can be used for monitoring insects. And we've conducted social studies via discussions and surveys with farmers, looking at farmer perceptions of biodiversity management and perceptions of stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders. But today what I'm focusing on is this core work, which is recruiting farmers and co-designing an intervention. So why co-design? So co-design, to describe it first, the way that research has typically been done for a long time is that researchers will come up with an idea, like maybe a new mix of species to test for pollinator mixes, or a new way of managing hedgerows, and then they'll go to farmers and they'll ask them, can I test this on your farm? Co-design is where you involve farmers in that research process much more closely. So you ask things like, what would you like to see improved on your farm? What type of interventions would you like to test? And how can we design an experiment to test those things together? And this approach has been gaining traction in the last decade. So it's really in fashion within science. So researchers are calling for it to be adopted more widely, and so are funders. So these are the major UK funders, that's UKRI, the major European funders, Horizon, and also major US funders as well, which totals research programs of over £100 billion. So this is a really significant move towards engaging participants and farmers in research more closely, which I think is a really positive thing. And the reason for that is that there are lots of benefits of co-design which have been shown in the literature. So it can promote things like trust and community, perspective exchange between groups with different opinions or people who may not have been in contact with each other before, knowledge exchange, and also the application of the intervention and behavior change. So if you include people who are going to be using the interventions that you're designing and testing in the research process, it's much more likely that they will adopt those interventions, and so will their neighbours. So this is strong evidence for the benefits of co-design. At the same time, the outputs can be unpredictable, which can be difficult for researchers who have to meet certain targets for funding. And it's also more expensive in terms of time and money. So these are two small words compared to lots of big words over here, but their importance should not be underestimated, because this could be used for conservation interventions or to develop agricultural interventions rather than using this for co-design. So I think co-design can be useful in some circumstances. I wouldn't recommend it blanket for every research approach, but I think in some circumstances it can be really useful and should be adopted. But it does need careful facilitation to make sure that people's voices are heard and to avoid unbalanced contributions. Within the Showcase project, this shows our process, which ran from March 2021 to January 2022. And one of the main things that was really valuable in this process was partnering with LEAF. So we recruited a lot of farmers through LEAF who had a really loyal existing member base. And when I spoke to those farmers at the beginning and asked them why they had joined the project, because it's important to understand people's motivations, many of them said that it was their existing relationship with LEAF that had encouraged them to join. So I think working with an intermediary that already had trust within the community was really valuable. Then we ran a series of online workshops. So this was actually during COVID. So in-person workshops were difficult at this stage. So we ran a series of online workshops to do introductions to different kinds of biodiversity interventions. And then I had in-person meetings with all the farmers. So this was a really crucial part to build individual trust and to take the time to make sure that you've heard from everyone. And then we ran a series of more workshops and phone calls to finalize options, and then implemented the field trial. And this process was conducted with 16 farms over southern England that represented a really wide range of farming practices and ecology. So some organic, some not organic, some large, some small and family owned. And you can see, for example, a range of different soil types here. And the types of questions that were asked, that I asked the farmers through the co-design process, were things like, what biodiversity and ecosystem functions would you like to improve on your farm? And then you can see the things that came up many times were soil health, insect pests, carbon sequestration, and also holistic management, which is where people would describe preserving biodiversity in general, and not necessarily targeted to individual species. Or questions around pests. So what were your primary pests? And you can see here that blackgrass came up very commonly, in addition to aphids and flea beetle. And then questions around management. So what crops are in your rotation? And you can see things like wheat and barley and beans, oilseed rape and linseed were included there. So I took all of this information. So these are just examples of some of the questions that I asked. I took all of this information and then combined it into a short list of options. And that was 5 options. So intercropping beans and wheat, nest boxes for solitary bees or wasps, looking at the effect of flower strips on soils specifically, looking at the effect of nest boxes and infield flower strips on natural enemies and pollinators, and then looking at different cover crop mixtures. So I presented these to the farmers and we discussed the benefits and disbenefits of different options and ultimately voted and selected cover crops. So a quick introduction to cover cropping. So cover cropping has been practiced for over 2,000 years. There's evidence of farmers cover cropping in ancient Greece and Rome, where they would till legumes into the soil to improve soil nutrient content. So you'll hear me talking about legumes a little bit. Legumes are the plants which have a special relationship with bacteria, which means that they can sequester nitrogen into the soil. So they're really valuable for soil nutrient content. And if you don't cover crop, you have a cycle that looks like this. So this would be where you harvest a crop. So in the UK, this may be, for example, harvesting wheat in August. And then if you don't cover crop, you have a long fallow period. So that essentially means that the field is left, and it can be left in various different ways, but nothing is planted there. And this fallow period would last until the spring sowing, which may be April or March. So maybe you would sow spring barley or spring wheat. So without a cover crop, you have a 6 to 8 month period where plants haven't been planted in the field. If you do cover cropping, then you're sowing a crop in this interim winter period. And the criteria for a cover crop is that it's not used to produce food. So you're not talking about something like barley or wheat here. You're talking about something that's planted to benefit the soil primarily. And the types of things that it will do to benefit the soil are it's plant cover, so it will reduce soil erosion, improving the structure of the soil, promoting soil biodiversity, and then they can also be used for other things, so for grazing sheep, for example. But primarily these are planted to protect the soil rather than leaving it fallow during the winter period. And these are just some images of fields that have had different management during this period. So this is a field that has been tilled. So it's bare. This is an example where you have a field that is left in overwinter stubble. So it's not bare, but it's not cover cropped. And this is an example of a cover cropped field. So this is where the cover crop has been planted. So you can see that management has a big effect on the way that the field looks and the environment. So this is where I guess a bit sciencey. So this shows the results of a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is where you take a lot of different scientific studies and combine them into one. So rather than showing you the results of a field trial where you compare one plot where you compare some plots against another plots, it takes lots of different studies and the average values for differences between plots. So it's a really robust way of looking at the effects of something because it combines lots of studies. And so this meta-analysis includes 57 publications and 326 experiments, which is essentially a lot of research. And this type of plot shows you, this is called a response ratio. And what this shows you is the difference between fields where you have cover crops versus where you don't. So I'm just going to highlight a few key things here. What this means is they found that food crop yield increased a bit in some cases because it's on the right side of the line, but it wasn't significant because sometimes it decreased, and it covers both, this estimate covers both sides of the line. For organic matter, it increased by about 9% on average, and this effect was significant. So cover cropping significantly increased soil organic matter. Soil microbial biomass was increased by 40%. You can see nitrate leaching here. So this is the runoff of nitrates, which can pollute water. So you want to reduce nitrate leaching. And you can see that sometimes nitrate leaching is reduced, and it can be reduced up to 75%, so quite a lot, but also sometimes it can increase. So there's a lot of variation in this. And then looking at weed abundance down here, cover cropping reduced weeds by about 25% on average. So this shows strong evidence of the benefits of cover crops. These benefits have caused increasing interest globally and nationally, and more farmers are adopting this practice, both within the UK and wider areas. And this is being supported by government payments and also private companies. So in the UK, some water companies, not all of them, but some water companies will pay farmers to plant cover crops to improve water quality. This feeds into the principles of regenerative agriculture, which you may have heard of. So regenerative agriculture is this movement which has been farmer-led, which is really exciting. So this idea, these methods have been developed by farmers, and these principles this process has been led by farmers. And this involves minimizing soil disturbance. So for example, reducing tilling, which is that heavy soil turnover. Maintaining living roots is really important. Protecting the soil surface, so that includes things like overwinter cover crops, which is what I've been talking about. Also increasing diversity. So arable crops are grown in rotation. You might have wheat, barley, oilseed rape, wheat, for example. And with regenerative agriculture, you would encourage greater diversity in this rotation, so getting more species into the mix. And also integrating livestock. So for example, using sheep to graze off cover crops at the end of the winter. This image comes from a conference called Groundswell, which is a farmer conference that runs in June. And if you're interested in learning more about farming and regenerative agriculture, this is a really fun and informative event that I recommend attending. More locally, you could go and see a new film that has come out about regenerative agriculture called 6 Inches of Soil, that's screening around the UK now. So I'd recommend going to see that. It's very good and really interesting, showing different types of regenerative farming practices. Okay, so the complicated thing about cover cropping is that all cover crops are not equal, and their impacts will vary quite a lot depending on how you manage them and also where you're planting them. So for example, the timing is really important. Planting earlier is better. So the cover crops will have longer in the summer to establish the earlier that you can get them in, which means they'll provide more benefits. The seeding method is also important. So this shows direct drilling versus broadcasting. So direct drilling is where you put the seeds into the soil. You have like a drill that essentially puts the seeds into the soil, whereas broadcasting is where the seeds are sprayed out onto the soil, kind of onto the surface of the soil. And then this is used a rotiller to lightly till those seeds into the soil. But you can see that drilling has been much more effective here at crop establishment. The cover crop species also has a really big impact. So this image shows different cover crop species. This is taken from Cotswold Seeds website, who supply cover crops. And you can immediately see that there's a big difference in the rooting structure of different cover crops. So this sainfoin is shown down to 2 meters, whereas some things like this white clover have much more surface roots. But they also provide different benefits. So some of them will fix nitrogen, so that's legumes, which store nitrogen into the soil, while others won't. And they have different surface covers. Some will be good for pollinators. So the species which you choose will have an impact on the effects of the cover crop. And this is just some more scientific evidence to back that up. So this is from the same meta-analysis that I showed earlier, but this is breaking down the difference in food crop yield between different types of cover crops. So here you can see that the yield of cover crops significantly increased, the yield of the subsequent food crop, so the crop that's planted after the cover crops, significantly increased if the cover crop was legumes, whereas if it wasn't legumes, it decreased. So this is just an example of how planting different species of cover crops affects the impacts to the crop and also invertebrates and other biodiversity. There's also an impact in terms of destruction. So the timing of destruction varies a lot. Some people will destroy the cover crops and then leave several weeks before the next planting. And other people will plant straight into the cover crops. And the removal method has an impact as well. So this plot comes from a 5-year trial that was conducted in northern France. And this shows the soil organic content change over that 5-year period. And so I want you to ignore these first 2 bars and just look at this one. And what you can see is that if the plots were not tilled, so that means if the soil wasn't turned over with a plow and it was cover cropped, the organic matter increased by 3% in the 5-year period. Whereas if the plots were tilled, in addition to the cover crop, the organic matter decreased by 2% within that 5-year period. So the effect of the cover crop interacts with whether the ground is tilled or not. In the UK, the primary way of removing cover crops is by spraying with herbicide and glyphosate in particular, which is an environmentally harmful herbicide. So this is about finding a balance between the environmental benefits of cover crops versus the environmental harm of spraying with a herbicide. And a lot of farmers minimize the damage of this by supplementing with other removal methods. So they may graze the cover crops in January or February before spraying off with the herbicide. And this reduces the plant cover and means that they need to use less herbicide. Or another practice is rolling off cover crops in the frost. So when crops freeze, when the cover crops freeze, they become vulnerable to breakage. So you can roll over them in this frost and they start to decompose, which means that you need less herbicide to spray them off. But still, in both these cases, the farmers will be using some herbicide. So for our experiment, we chose to focus on cover crop species and removal method. And in particular, we wanted to test the impact of different cover crop species with the aim of reducing the need for glyphosate. And so our specific question was, does winter cover crop frost tolerance affect biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and yield in UK arable farms? And the arable rotation that we were working in was wheat planted before the cover crops, and then cover cropping from August through to the end of February, and then spring planting of barley or wheat, depending on the farm. And this shows the theory of what would happen. So we had a 4-species mix of frost-sensitive species, some of which were sensitive to low temperatures, who would die off early in the cover cropping period, some of which were sensitive to even lower temperatures, which would die off later, and then some which were sensitive to very low temperatures, who would die off at the end. So this is the theory. And then we had a winter hardy mix, which was paired with this winter sensitive mix, but the species would not die off through the winter. And we designed these mixes in collaboration with Oakbank and the University of Worcester. And you can see that they were paired. So for example, we had vetch in both mixes, clover, then we had a grass, so oats and rye, and buckwheat and linseed. So we paired these species as much as possible to match them between the mixes, except for the fact that they were more or less tolerant to frost. And the theory is that this winter sensitive mix will provide organic matter for decomposers throughout the winter, improve the pores, soil pores for infiltration. So this is because the decomposed roots provide a pathway for water to move through when it rains, which can improve water infiltration during the winter when you get periods of heavy rain. There also would be less glyphosate needed to remove the cover crop at the end because it would have already decomposed, and less strain on planting machinery. We also had a control treatment where we didn't plant any cover crops. Where's my pointer gone? Oh, it's disappeared. Okay. Can you still see my mouse? No. Okay, sorry. Okay, we also had a control treatment where we didn't plant any cover crops. That doesn't mean that there weren't any plants, because there would have been some volunteers and weeds and things that would have come through, but we didn't plant any crops in this treatment. And then we also had an 8 species mix, which was a combination of the winter hardy mix and the winter sensitive mix. And these treatments were replicated in what we call a tram line experiment. So the plots were 200 meters long, and then they ran the width of a tram line, which was 24 to 46 meters, depending on the farm. And this was replicated over 11 farms. So we initially had 16 farms, but 4 dropped out due to drought, because in 2022, we had that really serious drought. And that meant that several of the farms could not get their cover crops in on time. So that was the theory, but what actually happened in reality? So in reality, the cover crops established quite well. They didn't establish as well as we would have hoped because of this drought. So there was quite a long period where we didn't get the cover crops in, which meant that they were planted later than usual. But you can see that despite this, they established well. So here on the bottom right, you have an example of the cover crop mix versus control. So you can see a real difference in the plant cover there. Here you can see a well-established winter hardy mix. And then here you can see all 3 treatments. So this is the winter hardy mix, this is the winter sensitive mix, and then at the back you can see the control, which has less vegetation cover. And you can also see this through the data that we collected. So this shows plant biomass weight. So we went out with quadrats and cut plant biomass, dried it, and then weighed it. And you can see that there were plants in the control, because of these volunteers and weeds coming through, but there was significantly higher plant cover where we had planted cover crops. So in the winter hardy mix, in the mix that included winter hardy and winter sensitive species, and slightly lower in the winter sensitive species, which is what we would expect because this was the end of the cover cropping period. So some of those species had already decomposed. And we measured the impact of these treatments on biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So we looked at plant percentage cover of different species and height using quadrats. For spiders and beetles, we use something called a vortice, which is like a reverse engineered leaf blower. So this suctions up air and also ground invertebrates. It suctions them up through here, and then it kind of whizzes them around here in a circle or a vortice and drops them into a suction cup here. And so this is how we sampled spiders and beetles, and then we identified spiders to species and beetles to family. We looked at earthworm species using soil monoliths, which is where you hammer out a square or a cuboid of ground and then hand sort it for earthworms. And we looked at earthworm species and biomass. In terms of functions, we looked at soil moisture, nitrogen content, organic matter, compaction, and structure. Decomposition using tea bags. So this is where you bury different kinds of tea, and then you come back a month later and weigh it and see how much tea has disappeared through microbial decomposition. And we also looked at crop yield and quality of the cereal crops and cover crops. I'm only going to present on a subset of these things today, partly because we haven't processed all of the data yet, but my email is at the end of this presentation. So if you do want information on anything I haven't presented on or further details, please do get in touch and I will be sure to keep you updated. So a quick introduction to spiders. So there's over 650 species of spider in the UK. Identification to family level includes things like their great eye structure, which is really cool. This makes a very good t-shirt, I can say. And you can see the cute little jumping spiders here, which are the most adorable of the spiders, I think is universally agreed. If you want to learn how to identify these, I would recommend formal training. It'd be quite hard to train yourself how to do this from an ID guide. And a good place to go for resources would be the Spider Recording Scheme, where you could learn more about spider identification. In terms of their ecology, you can broadly say that spiders are predators, are generalist predators, and so more spiders is better for pest control in general. And this shows the results of another meta-analysis. So this compares plots that have spiders against plots that have been manipulated to not have spiders. And essentially what this shows is that you get fewer pests. This has been changed so that anything above this line is a positive effect. So what this shows is that you have fewer pests where you have spiders. You've got better crop performance, nearly twice the crop performance where you have spiders, reduced crop damage, higher yields, and fewer pests. And that relates to spider diversity. So essentially what this is showing is that spiders are important for pest control. We collected 2,860 samples of spiders where we found over 1,900 individuals. And this includes sampling pre-treatment in the winter wheat crop, twice when the cover crops were in, and once in the spring afterwards, in the subsequent crop. And this hideous plot shows all the spider species that we found, and the colors show the species broken down into different families. And the main thing which I want to highlight here is that the most common color is this green color, which are liniphids. And liniphids are a huge spider family. They're the money spiders. They account for over 40% of the spiders that are found in Britain, and they're over 270 species. They are under 5 millimeters long, so they're the really tiny spiders, and they are very important for pest control. So they do help with pest control of things like aphids. So this is a really positive thing to find so many of them in the arable fields. In terms of spider abundance and the effect of the treatments, okay, so I'm going to talk you through this plot. This shows spider abundance on the y-axis, so more spiders would be higher up this line. And then this shows the crop pre-treatment. So this is this first sampling point, and the different colors show the different cover crop treatments. So you can see that before we put any of the cover crop treatments in, there was no effect between the control, the winter hardy mix, the mix of cover crop species where we had the hardy and the sensitive species, and the winter sensitive mix. And this is also true in the first round of cover cropping. The second round of cover cropping, we don't really see a difference between the treatments either, or in the cover crops post-treatment, or in the crop post-treatment. You might be wondering why we found so many spiders in January, February, which is this one, compared to the other treatments, when you wouldn't expect to see more spiders in January, February. And that's because this is the time of all the sampling periods where there was a lot more vegetation cover. So this is when we had the most vegetation cover of any time that we sampled, because this is when the cover crops were fully established. In terms of spider species richness, essentially we see no difference between the treatments as well, either before the cover crops were in, which is what we'd expect, but not when the cover crops were in or afterwards. I haven't presented these plots here, but another thing that it's important to look at is not just how many spiders we found and how many species we found, but which species we found in each treatment. And there was no effect of the treatments on which spider species we found either. So in conclusion, there was no effect of the cover crop treatments on spiders. Beetles. Okay, so there are over 4,000 species of beetle in the UK. At the broadest level, identifying to family, it's important to look at things like body shape and size. So things like how wide is it compared to how long it is, and what shape are the antennae, and what orientation. Identification to species is much harder. And if you're interested in learning about how to identify beetles, I recommend formal training again, and in particular, the UK Beetle Recording Scheme has lots of resources for that. Their impacts in agriculture are mixed. So it depends on the species. Here on the right, you can see a picture of the flea beetle, which you may recognize. They're the ones that jump around. So they have these springy kind of froggy legs or flea legs. And they are major pests. Sorry. So their larvae feed on plant roots, and the beetles feed on the leaves themselves. And that damage estimates to cost the UK £70 million per year. On the other hand, a beetle which gets a lot of attention for its benefits are dung beetles. And these are really important for nutrient cycling, soil health. Oh no, sorry. And for pest control in pastoral systems, so like reducing parasites in cows and things. And they're estimated to save the UK 37 million per year. So essentially the point I'm trying to make here is that different kinds of beetles do very different functions, some of which are beneficial for agriculture and some of which aren't. We collected over 3,500 beetles. And this shows the abundance of the different beetle families. So Chrysomelidae is the Latin name for leaf beetles. And leaf beetles includes flea beetles. And I can say from identifying these samples that the majority of these individuals were flea beetles, which means that they were pests. So that is not such good news for the farmers. But these other groups, Staphylinidae, which are rove beetles, and Carabidae, which are ground beetles, are really valuable for pest control. So they help to control things like aphids. So their high abundance here is a good sign. And also the diversity that we have. So we found lots of different types of beetle families, which is really good. Showing the similar plots to the spiders. So you can see beetle abundance here and the 4 different sampling periods. So pre-treatment, when both cover crops are in, and post-treatment. And then the colors showing the 4 different cover crop types. And you can see that there's no real difference between the treatments when the cover crops are in or post-treatment. There may be a slight increase in the winter hardy and mix, but this was not significant. And so this, if anything, would indicate increased pest abundance, but this result was not significant. So you can see that there are more beetles post-treatment when the crop is in the springtime. Okay, in terms of family richness, this also shows no significant trends. So there was no difference in beetle family richness between the treatments. And I also looked at composition, so which families we found in different treatments, and found no effect of the cover crops there either. So there was no effect of the cover crop treatments on spiders or on beetles. But on to earthworms, arguably the most exciting taxa of all. So there are 29 species of earthworm in the UK, which means they are more straightforward to identify than spiders or beetles because there are much fewer of them. And their identification focuses on essentially this part of the earthworm and the number of segments between the head and the saddle, which is this circle that you see. And that's what an example of a diagnostic feature for earthworms. If you find an earthworm and it doesn't have a saddle, that means that it's a juvenile and you won't be able to identify it. And if you want to learn more about earthworms, I really recommend that you visit the Earthworm Society of Britain website, and you can become a member there as well. And they have lots of really good resources for learning about earthworms, both in terms of how to identify them, their ecology, and their management. And earthworms do lots of important things. It's officially been proven by the Guardian readers, who you may or may not agree with, but you can't disagree with this finding that earthworms are the UK invertebrate of the year. Lumbricus terrestris claimed a landslide victory with 38% of the vote. So earthworms are officially great. And that's because they do lots of important things. So they're involved in decomposition, they improve soil structure, nutrient cycling, water regulation, carbon sequestration. And in general, you would say that more earthworms is better. So more individuals and more species. Most of the earthworms that we found were juveniles. So we found over 9,000 individuals, and the majority of them were juveniles. And then we found a lot of Chlorotica, caliginosa, hortensis, and longa, which is what you would expect to find in agricultural systems. We found no major differences between the treatments when the cover crops were in, but there was an increase in worm abundance post-treatment. So this is when the subsequent crop is in. So this would be when the cover crops have been incorporated into the soil a bit more, they've had time to decompose. So this does show an effect of the cover crops. We didn't find a difference in terms of species richness or in terms of composition. For ecosystem functions, I'm not going to present plots, but we found no effect of the treatments on soil moisture, soil nitrogen content, microbial decomposition, or soil organic matter. And we are still waiting to look at soil structure and compaction and crop yield and quality. In conclusion, I would say that co-design was a very successful method for creating a biodiversity intervention with the farmers. This was a really positive experience, and it's led to a lot of further collaborations beyond the plans of the initial project. The cover crops significantly increased plant biomass over winter, and earthworm abundance in the subsequent crop, and greater earthworm abundance has been shown in other studies to affect crop yield. So this is a really positive result. This did not translate to an increase in soil organic matter or nutrient content, but these benefits may accrue over longer timescales. So it's important to say that we only study the cover crops over 1 year, and actually the impacts of cover cropping over 1 year are only minimal to the impacts of cover cropping over multiple years. So where we did find an effect, for example, with the earthworms, this is evidence of a really strong effect. But where we didn't find an effect, it doesn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be benefits over longer timescales. And finally, I want to say thanks to everyone who has helped with this project, including people who've helped with the research itself, people who've provided advice, and most of all, the farmers for participating. Thank you.